Evolution is arguably one of the most important topics in biology, and it addresses how life changes over time. And to give the strict biological definition of what evolution is, it is the change in allele frequency at the population level over time. And a great example to illustrate what this definition means, it took place back in England during the Industrial Revolution, when there was no soot being emitted from the chimneys because they weren't burning coal yet. A lot of the trees had lichen on them, and the lichen was very white and bright colored. And because of that, moths that had light pigments on their wings would be well camouflaged and wouldn't be eaten by birds. Consequently, during this time period before the Industrial Revolution in England, all of the moths, the peppered moths, had this very white color that we see up here. Now, what happened after the Industrial Revolution took place, all this coal, all this soot began falling down onto the lichen of trees and making everything black. Any moths that had this white color would die. Consequently, all the peppered moths, they're the exact same species, but they expressed new alleles that would give them the darker color. And that was because darker colored pigments in their wings would camouflage them with the soot from the factories. Consequently, they would be able to survive, whereas the white colored peppered moths would die. And so this is an example of natural selection, specifically directional selection, in which we're going to get to in this video. And so evolution, it has four mechanisms at work. And what Darwin did, and what many of us know already, is that he published a book called On the Origin of Species. And in this book, he talked about the way natural selection works. But Darwin, he's just giving us one piece of the pie in terms of what is evolution. And so what Darwin did do that was very good in the field of biology and helping us understand this stuff is that he established the four main pillars of natural selection. And Darwin was influenced by many philosophers and very smart guys at the time. And so if we were to break down what is natural selection, it has four main components. The first one is something that I like to think of intuitively as carrying capacity. And this came from someone named Malthus. And Malthus, I believe, was an English economist. And they were looking at how there are finite resources and overproduction. And Darwin took these ideas and he applied it to life, because what we know about life is there's always, like, if you look at fish, they're always going to have more eggs than the environment can actually sustain. And so the environment has an inherent carrying capacity. Consequently, there's going to be competition. So competition is one of those main driving forces in natural selection that is causing our changes in allele frequency that we see in evolution as a whole. The next main pillar of natural selection has to do with variation in the individual. And this variation in the individual is caused by one person having different alleles present. We've heard of homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive. Depending on what kind of combination you have, you're going to be unique. And this variation in the individual means that you will have some kind of varied fitness to your environment. And fitness is a term that describes how well you can survive and reproduce. So it's kind of a catch-all term you'll hear a lot of biologists say, but this is a key point in natural selection. Next up, what we see is that, let's say you did have a variation in a trait that gave you more fitness to your environment. That trait has to be heritable to your offspring. And so a huge pillar is the fact that your traits are heritable. Your kids will get the alleles that you had. If you had a good combination of alleles, they're going to get those alleles. So these traits need to be heritable. And finally, there is unequal reproductive success. And this kind of alludes to the second mechanism of evolution, which is sexual selection. Maybe females like green frogs and not red frogs. So if you're a frog and you express red pigment, no female is going to like you, so you're not going to be able to reproduce. Consequently, you're not going to have any offspring. Okay, so those are the four main pillars of natural selection, which is one of the mechanisms of evolution. And natural selection, you can think of as having three types. There's something referred to as stabilizing selection. And so if you were to look at a Gaussian, which is just a bell curve, so if we had a population, and we'll pretend in this instance that the y-axis denotes height, for instance. What happens in stabilizing selection is that the extrema are favored against. So if this was our initial plot of height for all of our individuals in a population, what will happen in stabilizing selection is that we'll see that the average will be favored and extrema will be punished. And so if we lived in a world in which women really liked men who were exactly 5'10", the average height of a male, stabilizing selection would mean that the people who are 6'10" and 4'10" aren't going to do so hot, and we're just going to have an accumulation of people who are centered about that average. What happens in directional selection, if we again use that same analogy with height versus the individual, what happens in directional selection is, let's say we had an average height of 5'10", but women really like tall men. So what's going to happen in directional selection is we're going to see a shift in our Gaussian, our bell curve, to the right or the left. Maybe in some world women would like short men, and now our average height becomes 6'5". And this is what happens in directional selection. Now finally, we have something called disruptive selection. And what happens in disruptive selection is the average is favored against. So maybe women don't like guys who are 5'10". They really like really short guys or really tall guys. And so what will happen in these situations is that there will now exist two new bell curves. As you can see, like a bimodal distribution is what a statistician would call this. And so we would see these new areas and our Gaussian peak getting broken up into two separate peaks. Okay, and so that summarizes the types of natural selection as well as the main pillars that make up natural selection, and Darwin was instrumental in helping biologists and the science community arrive at these definitions. Now let's get on to what sexual selection means. Sexual selection has two forms. There's intrasexual selection as well as intersexual selection. What happens in intrasexual selection, if we look at what the Latin means here, intra means within. So intrasexual selection refers to when you have two males competing against each other for a female. And so you see this with frogs, and this is what intrasexual selection refers to. What happens in intersexual selection, inter meaning among, that means that you will have a male competing with a female, and in these situations you're going to see, like in peacocks, males will show off their plumage to try to woo a female, and this is a perfect example of what intersexual selection is. Now to get on to the next type or the next mechanism that drives evolution in biology, there's another thing called genetic drift. Genetic drift is essentially a way of saying you have noise in your allele frequencies, and this noise is caused by arbitrary chance events that happen. And a good example would be, let's say we had a field of tulips that were red and white, and a cow decided to walk through this field of tulips, and it just trounced all the white tulips. And there was no reason that the white tulips had to die other than the cow just happened to walk over all of them. But what you're going to see is in your population, there is now a change in that allele frequency at that population level, and therefore that is evolution. And it's entirely by chance. And finally, there's something called gene flow. And gene flow is caused by the introduction or the elimination of alleles from a population just due to individuals coming and going. So what you can think of in this example would be if we had a pond full of green frogs. There's no red frogs, but let's say a red frog just happened to come by and enter the pond, and now the population contains alleles for the red pigment in the frog's skin. So gene flow has just changed the allele frequency in this population as well. And then finally, another thing that biologists talk about sometimes is something called genetic equilibrium. And genetic equilibrium is something that is fictitious, but it allows us to apply equations like the Hardy-Weinberg equation to analyze allele frequencies. Genetic equilibrium is essentially anti-evolution. It's every single mechanism that we've just discussed, it will claim that it doesn't happen. So what happens in genetic equilibrium is we say that there is random survival, and random survival implies that natural selection doesn't occur because there's nothing to cause a change in our allele frequencies. We say that there is random mating, and that nullifies the mechanism of sexual selection. We also say that we are working with very large populations for genetic equilibrium to exist, and this means that genetic drift can't happen because the population level is so large that any deviations are not going to occur. And in addition to that, we say that our very large population is isolated, and having that population be isolated means that we're not going to have any individuals like blue frogs coming into our pond to make any changes in our allele frequency. The one additional thing that we assume for genetic equilibrium is called no mutations. And this, again, underscores why genetic equilibrium is a very fictitious term, because we know in reality, the way we create new alleles in practice is via mutations. And mutations will occur due to mutagens, such as chemicals or UV light from the sun. And in the real world, there are mutations and genetic equilibrium does not exist, but there are some instances in which we can use it and the Hardy-Weinberg equations to determine allele frequencies. And so that's going to wrap things up for this introduction to what evolution is, the pillars behind it, what are the main types of natural and sexual selection. I hope you guys find this useful, and thanks for watching.